It is the autumn of 1944, and the war in Western Europe is reaching a fever pitch. The Allied advance has stalled along a broad front, supply lines stretched to breaking point, and every man, every bullet, every litre of petrol has become precious beyond measure. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army with his customary ferocity, is pushing his forces eastward through France toward the Rhine, demanding speed, aggression, and above all, absolute loyalty from the men beneath his command. Patton is not a man given to sentiment. He drives himself as hard as he drives his soldiers, sleeps little, eats on the move, and expects from his officers something approaching the impossible. He believes in discipline the way other men believe in religion, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing force that separates armies from mobs. He has slapped men for cowardice. He has sacked generals for incompetence. And on the rare occasions when genuine moral rot surfaces within his command, he responds not with hand-wringing or quiet admonishment, but with swift and terrible resolve. So imagine for a moment what happens when word reaches Patton's headquarters that one of his own officers, not a private, not a sergeant, but a commissioned officer, has been taking money from the very enemy they are fighting. That this man has been enriching himself through dealings with German nationals at the precise moment when American soldiers are dying in the mud to push those same Germans back across their own border. What does Patton do? What can he do in the middle of a war when the machinery of military justice must somehow turn alongside the machinery of combat? The answer is more complicated, more human, and ultimately more revealing of Patton's character than most people realize. This is the story of corruption at the front, of a general forced to confront treachery within his own ranks, and of a justice that was neither swift nor simple, but was, in its own way, absolute. To understand why this incident mattered so deeply, you need to understand the particular conditions of occupied Europe in late 1944. As Allied forces swept through France and into Germany, they inherited a continent in chaos. Cities had been bombed to rubble. Civilian populations were starving. Black markets flourished in every liberated town and city, fed by a torrent of military supplies that moved through hands both authorized and otherwise. American soldiers found themselves in possession of cigarettes, chocolate, tinned goods and petrol, all of which commanded extraordinary prices in a civilian economy that had been stripped bare by years of Nazi exploitation. The temptation was enormous, and for the most part, the Allied High Command accepted a certain degree of petty pilfering as the price of occupying a devastated continent. A carton of cigarettes here, a tin of rations there. These were the lubricants of an informal economy that nobody was particularly proud of, but nobody could entirely suppress. What the command would not accept, what it could not accept if it was to maintain any pretense of military integrity, was systematic corruption by officers, men who had taken a commission and accepted both the privileges and responsibilities that came with it. It was in this environment that the case Patton came to deal with emerged. The precise details of the incident, as with so many wartime corruption cases, are partially obscured by the fog that surrounds military records of this period. Some documents remain classified, others were never compiled in the first place, because the chaos of combat did not always permit the luxury of thorough record-keeping. But the broad outlines are established well enough to tell the story. An officer, a man who held rank within Patton's command, had been using his position and his access to military resources to profit from dealings with German civilians and, in some accounts, with individuals who had direct connections to German military or administrative structures. The exact nature of the transactions varied depending on the source. Some accounts speak of the sale of military petrol, which was then funneled into the black market economy. Others mention the theft and resale of military equipment. What is consistent across the accounts is that money was changing hands, that this officer was receiving it, and that the transactions were benefiting people on the German side of what was, nominally, still a shooting war. For Patton, this was not merely a criminal matter. It was a betrayal of everything he understood soldiering to mean. The Third Army's military justice system in 1944 was not a slow or ceremonious apparatus. Patton ran his command like a man in a perpetual hurry, and the mechanisms of discipline within it reflected his impatience with delay and his contempt for bureaucratic process. A general court-martial, with its full complement of officers and its lengthy procedures, was available for serious offences, but Patton preferred, when the evidence was clear and the offence obvious, to act with what he considered appropriate speed. When the information about the corrupt officer reached him, Patton is reported to have been characteristically direct. There was no extended deliberation. There was no careful political weighing of the consequences. There was instead what those who served with him described as controlled fury, the kind of cold anger that Patton reserved for what he considered genuine moral failures, as distinct from the battlefield incompetence that might earn a soldier a sharp rebuke but not lasting contempt. The officer was relieved of his command immediately. That much is certain, and it was entirely within Patton's authority as army commander to do so without reference to higher authority. The man was stripped of his position, removed from any access to the resources he had been abusing, and placed under investigation. Patton ensured that the case was handed to the Judge Advocate General's office with a personal endorsement that left little ambiguity about how he expected the matter to proceed. What followed was a formal military investigation, the kind of painstaking process that the Army's legal machinery required regardless of how obvious the guilt appeared to the commanding general. Witnesses were interviewed. Financial records, where they existed, were examined. The nature of the transactions with German nationals was investigated as thoroughly as wartime conditions permitted. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The result was a court-martial that found the officer guilty on charges related to the misappropriation of military property and conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentence, rendered in the late autumn of 1944, included dismissal from the service, a disgrace that carried lifelong consequences in an era when military service was bound up with identity and social standing in ways that are difficult to appreciate today. The officer did not serve time in a military prison, though the possibility had been very much on the table. What he lost instead was his rank, his commission, and his reputation, which, in Patton's estimation, was the appropriate punishment for a man who had traded the honour of his position for German money. Patton's response to the case tells us something important about how he understood his role as a commander, and it is worth pausing to consider what that understanding meant in practice. He was not a man who believed that officers should be held to a lower standard than enlisted men. If anything, he held them to a higher one. The commission, in his view, was not merely a certificate of rank, but a moral undertaking. An officer led by example, and an officer who corrupted himself corrupted his command. It is worth comparing Patton's response with how similar cases were handled elsewhere in the Allied command structure during this period. Corruption in occupied territories was endemic, not uniquely American, not uniquely military, but a feature of any large organization operating under conditions of scarcity and reduced oversight. In some sectors, such cases were handled quietly, with officers shuffled sideways or encouraged to resign rather than subjected to the public machinery of courts-martial that might embarrass the command. In others, the investigations dragged on for months before producing any result. The institutional reluctance to expose internal failings slowing the process to a crawl. Patton's approach was different. He appears to have believed with genuine conviction that the worst thing he could do was allow the case to be managed quietly. A corruption case handled in the shadows was, in his view, nearly as damaging as the corruption itself, because it sent a signal to every other officer in the Third Army that the standards he professed to demand were negotiable. That rank provided a buffer against accountability that it was supposed to deny. By ensuring the case went through formal channels, by making clear that the officer's removal from command was not a favour, but a prelude to prosecution, he was making a statement about what kind of army he intended to run. The incident did not become famous in the way that Patton's more dramatic moments became famous. There is no mention of it in the popular histories of the Third Army's campaign through Europe. It does not appear in the film biography of Patton that introduced his legend to a new generation in 1970. It belongs instead to the category of things that armies do quietly and necessarily, the maintenance work of military justice that proceeds alongside the more photogenic business of combat. But its significance is not diminished by its relative obscurity. In a command as large and as logistically complex as the Third Army, the temptation to exploit position for personal gain was not an exotic aberration. It was a constant pressure, present wherever soldiers and resources and civilian populations intersected under conditions of diminished oversight. Patton's insistence on treating the case as a genuine criminal matter rather than a personnel inconvenience to be managed discreetly, had effects that rippled through the command in ways that are difficult to measure, but not difficult to imagine. Officers talk. They watch how their superiors respond to the failings of colleagues, and they draw conclusions from what they observe. A commanding general who protects his officers from the consequences of their corruption is, implicitly, setting the terms under which corruption will flourish. A commanding general who does not, who ensures that rank provides no immunity, who refers the matter upward rather than burying it, is making a different kind of statement. He is saying that the army he commands is not, at its core, a patronage network or a mutual protection society. It is, or at least aspires to be, something more demanding than that. The surviving records of this case, scattered as they are across the archives of the Third Army's administrative history, the Judge Advocate General's records of courts martial conducted in the European theatre, and the personal accounts of officers who served in Patton's headquarters during this period, do not permit us to reconstruct every detail with perfect confidence. Estimates suggest that dozens of courts martial for theft, corruption, and black market activity were conducted within the Third Army between September 1944 and the German surrender in May 1945. The exact number is not known with certainty, and not all of them involved officers of the rank implicated in the incident described here. What can be said with confidence is that Patton's command maintained a reputation, unusual in some sectors of the Allied force, for a certain severity in these matters. Men who served under him in France and Germany in those final months of the war speak, in their memoirs and in the oral histories recorded after the war of an atmosphere in which the standards Patton demanded were understood to be genuine rather than performative. That atmosphere was not maintained by speeches alone or by the famous bluster and theatre of Patton's public persona. It was maintained, in part, by the willingness to act swiftly, formally, and without favoritism when those standards were violated. We began this story in the autumn of 1944, in the midst of an advance that history would record as one of the fastest in the annals of modern warfare. Patton's Third Army swept across France and into the heart of Europe with a momentum that seemed to defy the logistical realities constraining every other command along the Allied front. That momentum was not purely a matter of tanks and petrol and tactical brilliance. It was also a matter of the less visible qualities, the discipline, the moral coherence, the insistence that rank carried obligation as well as privilege, that made a collection of individual soldiers into something capable of sustained, coordinated effort over hundreds of miles of contested ground. The officer who took bribes from Germans did not stop the Third Army. He was one man in a command of hundreds of thousands, and his crimes, however repugnant, were not strategically significant. But Patton's response to him was significant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. It reflected the same understanding of command that Patton applied to every other aspect of his generalship, that leadership is not merely a matter of inspiring men to do their best, but of ensuring that the worst is confronted and named and punished with the seriousness it deserves. There is a version of Patton that exists in popular memory: the showman, the braggart, the man with the ivory-handled revolvers and the contempt for the cautious, that tends to obscure the more complicated figure beneath. The Patton who drove an officer from his command and ensured his court-martial was not the flamboyant general of legend. He was something quieter, and in some ways more formidable. A man who understood that an army's character is expressed not in its finest moments, but in how it handles its worst ones. The officer was dismissed, the army moved on, and Patton continued east, toward the Rhine and the end of the war, carrying with him the conviction that the standards he had set were not negotiable, not for his enemies, not for his soldiers, and not, most emphatically, for the officers who wore the same uniform he did. That, in the end, is what Patton did.